The current situation is really bad for Myanmar. 1 in 3 people are starving, 3.5 million people are displaced. And according to our data, over 100,000 people are killed in conflict-related incidents.
Conflicts of Interest, brought to you by ACLED.
Welcome to another week of Conflicts of Interest. My name is Clionadh, Raleigh, and I'm here with the lovely Bron and the lovely Suman, as we will be discussing the conflict in Myanmar a bit today, for which Suman is an expert. And before we get started on that, Bron, what tragedies do you have lined up for us?
Well, it's mainly a lot of confusion around what's going on in the Middle East, right? And what to expect next. So basically what's happened over the last few days is all to do with tensions ramping up again. So this is the fresh US strikes on Iran and then the Iranian retaliation against various bases in the Gulf. And I actually saw a really helpful kind of infographic that came out from the EOS risk group a couple of weeks ago. And it's basically a cycle. And it goes from Iran hits a ship, US hits the bases, Iran responds and escalates, Iran targets the Gulf states, further strikes come from the US, then they agree to stop attacking each other, shipping resumes, but the underlying disputes remain unresolved, and then there's a new trigger event and it goes back to bombing a ship. So what I was really interested in, Clionadh, is how long you think this kind of cycle of stuff is going to continue.
It can continue, I think, indefinitely. It relates to, obviously, discontent on everybody's end about what's going to happen with the Strait. So these are kind of the original sins, of the whole conflict in the first part, which is who controls the Strait, and then how much do the Gulf states take of just kind of sheer punishment for the decision to go in as they did to Iran and start this conflict process. And so what I mean that it can continue indefinitely is that what Iran wants for the Strait is completely not what anybody else wants for the Strait. And so the various solutions that have been attempted to prevent Iran from taking total control, the blockade, the attacks, or even the southern strategy that we discussed 2 weeks ago, all of those are ways in which people have been trying to work around Iran, right? And Iran cannot let this go, right? It's an extremely important component of their way forward, not just for economic reasons, also, of course, for the strength of the new government. They need to be able to show that they did not give up the crown jewel. But in a third way, it's super important for their future engagement with the Gulf states, because if they don't have control of the Straits, their ability to affect how the Gulf states and Iran kind of goes along in the next few years has been completely eradicated. They become a major problem rather than some sort of a regional hegemon. And so it's the most important feature for Iran, how this goes. And so that cycle, it's not costless to them, right? But it is far less costly than having to negotiate with the US about less control over the Strait. So we should expect this to continue unless there is some sort of a major knockout, which we have seen the US being unable to produce at this point. I struggle to think that there's any negotiating around this point. They are at diametrically opposed positions here. And of course, in the interim, while this ceasefire or chats have been going on, there have been some kind of positive developments in the sense that the attack ceased for the most part. The price of oil has decreased pretty substantially. I think it's between 72 and 75 at the moment. And so the benefits of it have been kind of maybe banked by everybody. One way to look at this is if they continue this kind of constant back and forth and the Strait remained open, this could be fulfilling what the US wants, which is a low oil price, especially leading up to the midterms. They're not attacking Israel, which is quite important. And the reason that that's important is that if they were to bring in Israel, it would start a whole new dimension of this conflict. But that in the same way still works with the US. Okay, so you've got a low oil price, no attacks on Israel. And then the question is whether or not their bases can take incoming constantly. I would say no, but they could go back to their lower strategy of like attacking everything but the bases. And it's not great, but is it something that the US could live with? Potentially.
And it's interesting that one point on that cycle is the underlying stuff still remains, right? Because when this began, it wasn't anything to do with the Straits. That's come since, right? With the closing and the opening. It didn't feature in the top reasons at the beginning.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the top public reasons were not control of the Strait, but everything about this had to do with control of the Strait. But when I say that this can continue forever, this will continue forever. Like control of the Strait will be an issue in 25 years, it will be an issue in 50 years for all sorts of different reasons. So the Southern strategy really seemed like, but so too did the blockade, seemed like an interesting power play. And it's just Iran can't let that go unless the cost to Iran is so overwhelming. They have to compromise on that point, and they're nowhere near that point internally.
And then elsewhere in the news, of course, we've got lots going on around Ukraine because Russia has continued that wave of missile and drone strikes. And then Ukraine has continued to attack deep inside Russia. And this is all going on as the European leaders are meeting to discuss more support for Ukraine in that way. On that kind of notion of what's likely to shift now, what can European leaders actually do at this point to get involved? Is the end in sight? Is there a light at the end of the tunnel at this point?
I mean, I think it will come quite quickly when it comes, but I don't know if it's this predictable, right? They always say this, everybody's fully in until one day they just say, we're compromising, we're going to have this peace deal. But it's very rare. It's actually potentially more common in a situation like Myanmar, which we'll be talking about in a while, whereas that you see the decline in one party's ability to contest so significantly over time that the end of this becomes much more normal. This is not what we're likely to see in this conflict or in Iran. There's very good fronts on all ends. But I would say there was a little bit of a blow to both Israel and Ukraine this weekend with the death of Senator Lindsey Graham. He was an avid proponent for U.S. military power around the world and had the president's ear while he was doing this. And the fact that he died quite suddenly, I believe, of a tear in his heart, despite having just been to Ukraine, I think he spoke to Zelensky on Friday, that would have been to fortify U.S. support of the Ukrainian situation. And in doing so, the U.S. support for Ukraine is really closely tied to this notion that Europe is going to pick up some of that slack. Of course, Europe have their own reasons for being very, very invested in Ukraine. What I would say is that Ukraine is kind of making its own weather at the moment in terms of how much support they're able to sustain, and they're doing very well. If they can keep up this level of pressure on Russia, they will make some very good strides. But I really will emphasize that the air war, if you want to call it that, between drones, etc., between Ukraine and Russia, is really not the same as the ground war, where Russia still is making progress, even if tiny levels of progress. That is still happening. No one's ever won a war by the air. It's not something that happens. So it's simply this stage or this scale of the war is going very well for Ukraine. They will be able to reap the benefits of that, but it does not signal the end of this war.
As far as these kind of step-by-step updates that we seem to be getting from the Middle East and from the Russia-Ukraine war, it's quite different to what's happening in Myanmar and how many times you hear about it, how frequent it is, and how maybe most people don't fully understand how complicated it is.
The interest in conflicts like Iran and Ukraine, right? The interest is very high because of the countries involved. There's no question of that. And the proximity to all of this kind of major international press. The wars are actually not all that different in the sense that they go by fits and starts, right? They make progress and there's a regression. You make progress and there's a regression. And you've already seen that in both the Ukraine and the Iranian situation, you have to be like a real fiend for it to keep up with all of these things. And so I would actually say the same of a case like Myanmar, which is that it's very consequential. In many ways, it's fascinating about what it says about warfare, especially in the region, but it's not fallen off people's agenda because it's not similar to these wars. It's really because it's just not proximate to them.
Would you agree with that, Sumana? Talk us through the origins and how they were understood at the time.
Myanmar is actually experiencing conflicts, not just 5 years ago. It's been exposing to conflicts since they gained independence from British colonial rule in 1940s. So military junta is fighting war against ethnic armed organizations who wanted far more autonomy in the independent state from the central military governments. So this military junta is fighting against either armed groups at different parts of the country for a long time, at least 7 or 6 decades now. So many outsider countries see Myanmar problem as a more domestic problem. It's like unfinished, like longest running civil war, rather than a conflict which has regional implications. Since the military coup in 2021, neighboring countries like Thailand, Bangladesh, China, and India, they are seeing more conflicts spill over, affecting their countries and their borders. But we only recently see more strategic regional implications. And then that's when regional countries and leaders started interested in Myanmar conflicts and more involved in resolving Myanmar conflict.
Because when we look at how ACLED formats things, we had a lot of questions towards the end of last year about fragmentation and what role that plays in the dynamics. And obviously, Myanmar is quite fragmented as far as that goes. Would you mind explaining the different actors involved and how that has become what it is today?
So right now, since after the coup in 2021, we are seeing more than thousands ethnic resistance armed groups operating inside Myanmar. It seems like a lot and complicated, but these hundreds of actors mostly fit into two categories. If we want to exclude state army, Myanmar military, and their collaborators as one category, we will have two other categories, which is one, anti-coup resistance groups. So these are newer resistance groups. They are mostly comprised of people who joined the civil disobedience movement. So students, teachers, university students, and pro-democracy and other activists. And these groups are full of young people. Many of these groups refer to as People Defense Forces, PDFs, because they emerged in response to the military attacking peaceful protesters soon after the 2021. So they formed to defend local community from military persecution and to prevent a weakened military rule and to be able to pressure military out of politics. So from their point of view, they are fighting for country's democracy. And then we have a dozen of older, more well-established ethnic armed organizations, which I briefly touched on earlier. So they have been fighting for greater autonomy for 7 or 8 decades. Some of them started since the independence. So they mostly operate in ethnic states and on borders. So in the eastern side with China and then in southeastern border with Thailand and the west border with Bangladesh and western north with India. So these ethnic armed groups provide training, equipment, and shelter to newer anti-coup resistance groups. And depending on where these newer anti-coup resistance groups are based and operate, they are either aligned with these EUs or enabled by the EUs. So the conflict landscape in general is we are seeing in Myanmar is many armed groups under these two categories joining hands over the common goal of defeating the military. And the battlefield success and setbacks are also depend on how these groups can work together or not.
I have a question for you, Suman. You mentioned, of course, that the situation has changed quite substantially since 2021. There was a very well publicized coup, and figures that many people will know from Myanmar had a very difficult time. Perhaps you can explain some of those kind of more public representatives of Myanmar and what's happened to them since. But besides that, I'm wondering about how you would characterize the conflicts since 2021 by year, because it seems to me that there's been a pretty big shift in what that conflict looks like year on year, and we've just come up to an anniversary.
So when the military staged the coup, and then they also present the ruling government, state councillor, and the ruling party, lots of them are put in prison. And the country leader and state councillor Aung San Suu Kyi, this Nobel laureate, she's also put in prison. In fact, many people don't know whether she's still alive or not. So the campaigns are concentrated right now, demanding the military to provide any proof of life. So that's how the campaigns also progress over the years. The men in the military leave out of the politics, and now we are seeing the campaigns where we demand the proof of life of Aung San Suu Kyi. And in terms of conflict, there are very significant shift, like at least 3 conflict turning points that almost changed the whole political system. So starting from 2022, In late 2023, we are seeing two major developments. One is the use of drones by resistance groups. So as I mentioned earlier, these newer resistance groups, they are comprised with younger people who grew up in digital age and who's familiar with computer games and drones. So they bring these innovation and adaptation of commercial drones to the battlefield. And that also allows them to gain confidence from the older established EOs and to boost the cooperation between these two armed groups with slightly political objectives. Their incorporation of drones actually, of course, inspired by Ukraine-Russian conflict, mostly inspired by the Ukraine innovation of drones and adaptation. So these drones discourage the military troops who are mostly fighting because they are commanded to fight against the resistance group, not because they are willing to. So these drones are really effective in morally demoralizing the military troops and shifting the position from defense to offensive. And what combined these technological incorporation is the cooperation between EU's resistance group in very successful operation known as Operation 1027, which was launched in late 2023. So these operations started as an operation against scam centers operating in northern State. But because they are military capable and they started using these achievements to incur into Myanmar center, so more territories, and they've been capturing over 20 towns. So these two developments threat the military because they capture like 1/3 of the country in terms of territories, and they reach so close to the military center, the second capital city of Mandalay, which is so close to the military headquarters. That pushed the military to the edge to come back with the advanced drone technologies, and China also have to step in to throw a lifeline to the military, provide military support, drone technology, air defense systems, training. That includes China being a patron, inviting the military leader in different regional cooperations where military leader also connect with Iranians and secure more aviation gas or aviation fuel. So China had to step in, and then from there, the military, because it had time to reinstitute itself, so it also had time to come back with some counteroffensive.
Can I ask very quickly, Simone, that's super interesting. So who in the 2022-2023 period, when you said that the many kind of local resistance groups started to use drones, who provided those drones?
So in the beginning, they could procure these commercial drones very easily from borders. So these drones are actually coming a lot from China. So with the approval of Chinese authorities through Chinese companies. And then they also procure through the Thailand border. But after Operation 1027 really threatened the military existence, and Beijing really concerned about the collapse of the center because that is not in their strategic interest. They don't want to deal with a lot of armed groups across Myanmar to implement an economic project. They prefer to deal with one manageable, predictable leader. So since these resistance groups capture border towns, China responded by shutting down the border gates. So China shut down all the 20 border gates along Myanmar-China border, since the resistance group could not buy any more drones or spare parts or even like the batteries for dual use. So China restricted the imports and exports on the dual use items as well. China also pressured other ethnic armed organizations who are not fighting the military, but very powerful, for example, like United World State Army. This army is the source of weapons and ammunition for most resistance groups. So they also pressure this group not to support anymore to resistance groups. So these are among the Beijing's coercive measures, in addition to ceasefire, pressuring armed groups to enter ceasefire with the military to relinquish captured territories back to the military.
That's super interesting. So what we can see here is that the Chinese, just like many other countries around the world, will do a lot to prevent regional fallout from a multi-actor conflict. I mean, Myanmar really takes it to whole new levels with the multi-actor conflict in the sense that there are hundreds of these groups, of which they've only rarely consolidated in any particular way. So can you talk a little about why are there so many groups? Why can't they get along or not get along and decide kind of on a sequenced political strategy? What do you think's behind it?
Because on that as well, Clean, but wider public, as far as that goes, it's like the idea about having lots of different groups like that is if there are hundreds of groups, then there must be hundreds of agendas as well. But it sounds like there's two kind of clearer sides to this. So what's driving that?
Yeah, so this also related to your first questions about how I will categorize the conflict. So far, since the coup, over the 5 years, the conflict has been pretty much focusing on the defeating military. So this is the one common goal that both actors, ethnic organizations, and anti-coup resistance groups share. But more than that, they have different ideas about especially how we govern this country, what would be the post-conflict governance structure. So anti-coup resistance group, they would prefer democratic system and they prefer federal democracy. But among the ethnic organizations, some of them agree to federal democracy systems with, of course, ethnic states having more power and autonomy. But some ethnic groups, they prefer the confederation-like status. So although they agree on the common goal of defeating the military, they don't have agreement or they don't have political settlement among them. And that is the other factor that restricting deeper military cooperation between them. So since Operation 2027, basically these resistance groups have already captured all the rural strategic centers they could, and that is the maximum capacity they could do without having political settlements among them. Because to push inward to the central Myanmar, the central power center, they need a political settlement, which they haven't. So they are independently, loosely operating because they lack the post-conflict vision. And that's also another reason that Beijing publicly supported the coup leader Min Aung and the military rule. Because Beijing also see these cracks. Beijing also know that the resistance, they have been struggling to unify and to have a political coherence that Beijing needs political guarantee to protect their investment in Myanmar, billions of dollar project investments in Myanmar. So we don't see that is happening in the resistance side as well. So that's another reason that it's sided with the military.
That's super interesting because I suppose it's very difficult for a government to die by 1,000 cuts. It can take way, way, way too long rather than some sort of a fatal blow. But they can't organize enough to get to that fatal blow so they can then have those arguments about democratization and yeah, not looking great. But I guess one thing I would like to ask is what is everyday life like then for people in Myanmar? Even if you're in the government or if you're somebody who lives in the rural areas, what is your experience with conflict or change?
I could answer with ACLED terms. Many people in conflict directly affected areas, they've been displaced. And then they've been repeatedly targeted by the military. Sometimes resistance capture this particular town, and then because it's strategically important, and then military recapture this territory, and then resistance group trying to recapture. Because of these many territories hand over between military and the resistance group, many of people in that conflict areas are exposed to airstrikes repeatedly, artillery shelling, drone strikes, and all that. It's even worse because the Iran crisis and the impact on fuel prices and all that. Many people in conflict-affected areas, they cannot move back to the area to start their normal life or even grow farm in that area. But if we look at the urban areas, many of those displaced people either cross the border into other countries or they move to capital city like Yangon, Mandalay. And then we are seeing a lot of people who live in these urban centers without enough fuel, electricity, and internet. So they got like 8 hours electricity for one day. So the life is very difficult. And because the military also enforced the conscription law in February 2024, and then they've been training 5,000 recruits per intake, and they've completed about 20 training cycles. It means that they have now 100,000 draftees, and like 90% of them are now already operating in the front lines. That also many young people fled the country. So the unemployment and the exodus of young people. The current situation is really bad for Myanmar because UN itself already said that 1 in 3 people are starving in Myanmar and 3.5 million people are displaced. And according to our data, over 100,000 people are killed in conflict-related incidents. So because of these situations, both resistance group and both military are also suffering because of this situation. So like Myanmar also, if you remember, Myanmar also experienced the devastating earthquake in March 2025. That also destroyed all the economic base that is supporting for resistance groups. So resistance groups are already dealing with their supply bases being devastated by earthquake and economic situations. So what we will be seeing in the, let's say, next 6 months, the conflict might evolve into something beyond fighting for democracy, competition for political system, or it could involve fighting or competition over resources, because both resistance group and the military, they need resources to fund their military operations, and country is not doing well at the moment.
So when we look at the items that have caught the media's attention to do with the life for everyday people, one of them is about the weaponry itself and how people have moved away from traditional weapons, if you like. And I think one of the phrases used recently in an article by The Guardian was military evades sanctions by using hobbyists' motorized aircrafts to bomb civilians in opposition-held territory. So what are we looking at there? I mean, it's very well known for drone use. I think that's referenced quite a lot. But then as far as what these other less typical weapons look like.
Thanks for bringing this up, Bron, because it's very important. I think Myanmar is the only conflict that military that use paramotors and gyrocopters. These other aircrafts in conflict more widely. In the beginning, I suspect that they might be inspired by Hamas, the use of paramotors, but this becoming more common in Myanmar, and the military are locally producing these paramotors. Okay, according to the data, military is incorporating additional forms of aircrafts like drones, paramotors, and gyrocopters in their campaign, but they are still using airstrike as their main campaign, area campaign, but they are adding additional aircrafts. The most possible reason for these technologies and this use of aircrafts could be that they are now installing the air defense system in their military bases. So because the concern about resistance group attack, like drone attacks, they use this air defense system, and the paramotors and gyrocopters, these aircrafts can easily bypass any jamming. So basically they are protecting themselves with the advanced air defense, and then they are having other additional aircrafts that can bypass their own jamming and can attack resistance groups. So that is one reason they've been using these. And also because military is warring with the whole country, basically. So the conflict happening in 323 townships out of total 330 townships. Only 7 townships we don't see any political violence are remote and isolated area. So because it is warring with the whole country, it requires different kinds of like operational flexibility. Airstrikes require command chain and the bureaucracy. But these operating these paramotors and gyrocopters, they can lower ranked officers can easily operate. And the effect is like as deadly as airstrikes.
Because when we were talking about Ukraine earlier, Clionadh, we mentioned that you can't win completely through aerial warfare alone. But then when you look at Myanmar, it's certainly one of the main contributing factors for the huge fatality counts that we're looking at, right?
Certainly, I would say that is definitely the case. But I guess, Simone, I would ask you whether the government think that they can solve these conflicts. I mean, is it, it never appears that, to me at least, that they're working towards a resolution for the post-2021 conflicts or even the pre-21 conflicts. It's more like they're willing to manage the amount of violence by doing these things without it feeling like it was going to affect their survival in power.
I think the issue with the military regime is that it's not they can't resolve this conflict. It's that they don't want to resolve the conflict. So when the former military and the coup leader Myanmar assumed presidency in April, he basically issued the ultimatum inviting ethnic armed groups to join the peace talks. So like the ultimatum 100-day peace plan, he called it 100-day peace plan. It will end by the end of July. So he invited only ethnic armed groups, and he excluded all the anti-coup resistance groups because he asked them to surrender. He doesn't want to invite for peace talk. But since he issued this 100-day peace plan, what the new military commander-in-chief's been doing is the increasing counter-offensive operations into these ethnic armed organizations areas and territories. So he invited for the peace talks. At the same time, he's taking military actions to get the upper hand if there is a negotiation and to have a strategy leverage to recapture many territories as much as possible. At the same time, the resistance groups are not saying they don't want to negotiate. Resistance groups are saying that they want to negotiate, but they want to negotiate and have an inclusive dialogue, not excluding hundreds of armed actors, basically. When military exclude PDF from peace talks, they are basically excluding thousands of resistance fighters. So that won't be any peace plan. And at the same time, military is resuming the peace talks with other ethnic armed organizations who already had ceasefire with the military. So basically, there are ethnic armed organization who already has ceasefire with the military. And then some of them, after the coup, some of them basically abandoned the ceasefire plan and they joined the resistance fight. So militaries, on the other hand, they're resuming peace talks with the other ethnic armed organizations who had the ceasefire. All they've been doing is telling them to secure the border and to secure the border trade. Not talk about the political governance and it's not a political settlement. So Myanmar conflict is complicated, but at the same time, so far it has been all about political problem. Different actors trying to solve the political problems militarily. So if you want peace, you can talk about political issues, but military hasn't been doing that so far.
What I find really interesting about this is that Myanmar could become one of those states, a bit like Mexico, in which the amount of violence is quite shocking and quite high and takes on all sorts of different dimensions, kind of what you were speaking about, Simone, whether it's a political survival dimension or it's a substitute for politics or it's mainly economic, but it has a political affiliation or it has a political outcome. And this can continue for decades, because the violence becomes the fuel that keeps the system running, which most people have invested enough in to not want it to change.
Yes, I totally agree. Yeah, this has been the case for Myanmar.
And is that likely to continue then? If we were to talk about what is likely to happen next, where the next sort of movement on this is going to be, is that what you're expecting? Just more of the same?
Yes, so I'm expecting that military might escalate counter-offensive operations to even more pressure on armed groups. And then they also have a pressing matters because China is also pushing them to resume all the economic projects, especially economic projects under Belt and Road Initiative, which would give China direct access to Indian Ocean because it's more important for China than ever. So they also having these pressing matters to resume economic projects. To do that, military is likely to even double down on counter-offensive operations to recapture these territories and resume economic projects.
And Clionadh, on that global stage, when you think about China's role in this, how kind of key is that?
It's super key. It seems like China really rescued the military as it currently is from some very difficult situations a few years ago, as Simone mentioned, and they were able to have a successful, I'm putting that in quotes, successful election last year, in part because of China's support. So it's quite obvious that they've become a little bit like a client state to China. And so being that, they will have to pay up. And it sounds like access to the Indian Ocean is the cost. That was great, Simone. Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Conflicts of Interest with Professor Clionadh Raleigh, brought to you by ACLED, the world's leading source of political violence and protest data. Subscribe so you never miss an episode and follow us on socials for updates in the meantime.